Got it. Okay, cool. All right, so I guess I can go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for attending this session called the One Education Culture Code You Need to Stop Following. So my name is Kayla Tucker. I am a school psychologist and also a stress management coach for women in K-12 principalship. I currently live in the DC area, but I've worked in a few different schools across all levels, from early childhood education to higher education and also across states. So early on in my career, I experienced extreme levels of stress that eventually led to burnout. And I thought that my only way to kind of get out of that space was to leave education as a whole. Long story short, I ended up staying and I figured out how to effectively manage stress and really prioritize my health and well-being. And now I help school principals to do the same. So just some general kind of quick notes. As you all know, this presentation is interactive. So there will be a few times where I ask you to drop something in the chat. There's also a short activity that we'll do together towards the end of this. So you may want to have a piece of paper and a writing utensil handy. And lastly, please feel free to leave your questions in the chat. I will leave time at the end to go back and answer any questions that you may have. And now that I have introduced myself, I would love to hear a little bit more about you. So I want you to put a 1 in the chat if you work primarily within the classroom, meaning maybe you're a school psych like me, an interventionist. 1 if you work primarily outside of the classroom, like me, a school psych, an interventionist, an administrator, a superintendent, etc. And a 2 in the chat if you work primarily in the classroom. Okay, so I'm seeing 1s coming through and a couple 2s. Nice. Awesome. All right, let me jump over to the next one. So just as a quick overview, we're going to talk briefly about kind of what a culture code is. So we're going to do an introduction to culture codes, talk about how it affects us as educators personally, what it means for how we serve professionally, the impact of stress and tips for managing stress, and then also the bigger picture of what you might have to overcome to stop following this culture code. So first, like I said, we'll do an intro. So let's talk first about what exactly a culture code is. I feel like we talk a lot about school values and core values, even in terms of higher education. Obviously, it's not necessarily limited to one particular building, but higher institutes of higher education do have general values that they tend to follow. And culture codes can sometimes be something that people are a little less familiar with. They're similar to values, but not exactly the same. So when we look at the definition of the word culture, it's the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. In this case, for education, it would definitely fall more so kind of in the social group side of things. And then when we look at the definition of the word code, it is a set of conventions governing behavior or activity in a particular sphere. So then when we put those two things together and we look at culture codes based on my definition, we're talking about the conventional beliefs about behavior or activity within education. So now we're going to jump forward to some examples of culture codes. So the first one I have here is be an energy giver. And this one comes from Patreon, who I think Patreon is really gaining some traction. But if you don't know about Patreon, it is a membership program for content creators. The second one is encourage independent decision making. And this comes from none other than Netflix, the content platform and production company. And then the third example that I have here is leaders provide direction and guidance and get out of the way. And they literally have get out of the way capitalized, just as I have here in their actual culture code. And this comes from Spotify, which is a digital streaming platform. So I would like for you to kind of think about education culture codes, particularly where you are, whether you are working in a K-12 school building or if you are working in higher education. What are some of the culture codes, either spoken or unspoken, that you may have noticed? And I did add some examples to this slide. I would love for you to drop any that may come to mind in the chat. And I will kind of go through these as you drop those. So the first one I have here is this expectation of doing your best. I think that this one kind of is seen more frequently, I think, in the K through 12 setting, both for students and for staff. It's the idea that students are expected to come to school and do their best, and that staff are also expected to put their best foot forward in terms of serving students. Another education culture code is self-advocacy. This one is starting to come more to the forefront, particularly for educators and school leaders in terms of advocating for what they need as educators, but it also kind of funnels into the experiences of students, particularly students of a particular age. I would say maybe high school, possibly even middle school and beyond. This idea that once you know that you have certain needs, or you have something going on that an adult in the building may or may not know about, it's on you to be able to go to that adult and advocate for what you need or make your needs known. Emotional constancy. I love that one. Yep, that is a great example of a culture code. And then this final one that I have here is ongoing coaching and support. And this is one that may or may not be present in different school buildings, but of course it is the idea that everyone should have ongoing support, that particularly for staff members, support should not come in the form of, only PD. It should be something that is happening on a regular basis throughout the school year. Heather says, I'm hearing a lot about grit. Yep, that's another one that is coming up a lot, particularly as we are kind of unfortunately entering this second school year in the pandemic. Grit is definitely one that is coming up. Yes, students should feel safe, or people should feel safe in buildings, absolutely. There's a culture of safety, of inclusion, whether that be literal physical safety. Of course, when we start talking about, potential traumatic events that happen in schools, or if we're talking about psychological safety, I think all of that falls under that umbrella, absolutely. Awesome. Okay, so this is the one unspoken and kind of highly problematic culture code in education that I think is so deeply ingrained that it requires a major disturbance to change. And that culture code is serving others relentlessly. So educators oftentimes are socialized very early on to kind of be martyrs to the education system in the name of service. I mean, even just thinking about our mottos or our slogans for various school districts, how often is it we always put children first, or children first always, or some rendition of that, right? And while that is true, there are also adults who have to serve those students. So then that kind of begs the question of, where do the adults fall in the equation? So this is kind of touted as the key to best serving students, right? Or serving students well is to always put them first. But I think that the key to actually serving them well is to kind of turn that idea on its head and ensure that we are well suited and well supported to be able to support them, because people only get the best of us when we have the best to give. And in that vein, focusing on taking care of ourselves is kind of the best way to ensure that we can also serve others well. So while this requires a greater focus on well-being in general, there's data out there that shows that 75 to 90% of doctors' visits are all related to stress. And there are many health complications that are directly related to stress. Stress is a very specific part of the larger well-being puzzle. And like I said, this kind of idea of serving others relentlessly, some may call it like the martyr mentality or sacrifice syndrome, or the giver syndrome. That's something else that I've heard. They're all huge problems, and we're kind of conditioned to serve others and be burnt out, or take care of ourselves and lessen our impact. It's positioned as either this or that. And I think that it is really more of an and. So we can serve others well and also take care of ourselves without lessening our impact. So I would like for you to kind of use your imagination. If you are someone who really struggles with this, think about the impact of this kind of shift on your health and your well-being, for your ability to show up for your staff and or your students. So what would things look like if you didn't operate this way and kind of run yourself into the ground? And if you can do everything that you have been doing, particularly in this last school year, if you can do all of these things now while you are stressed or overwhelmed or fill in the blank with whatever you have been feeling lately, how much more impactful, how much more effective, and how much more efficient would you be if you actually focus on sustaining yourself? And I think oftentimes for educators, a lot of us take these jobs, not just because we need jobs, but because we actually feel like this is part of our calling. And just because you want to serve doesn't mean that you can't be served. So when we look at kind of the domino effect specifically for school leaders, which is kind of my wheelhouse, when we look at what could be possible when you trade this kind of culture of relentless service for one of kind of a wellness first model, there is this domino effect that occurs kind of from the top down. So when the leader well-being improves, you also see improved student achievement, increased teacher retention, increased morale, and also just a healthier community as a whole. So aside from the personal benefit of taking care of yourself, your well-being also has a direct impact on the other people you serve and work alongside. And even if you are not a leader in the maybe the traditional sense, perhaps you do not have a leadership title, I believe that all educators are leaders in some way, shape, or form. So I think that this applies to all of us. Oh, sorry, one other thing I wanted to mention also in terms of this domino effect, as you can see here, is kind of broken down into two categories. So there are some things, some ways in which your school community is affected in ways that are quantitative, meaning the things that we can measure with numbers, like test scores and overall student attendance and things of that nature, as well as things that are more qualitative, the non-numerical things that we don't or that we cannot measure as easily. This overall shift has a positive impact on all of those things. So next, when we talk about this idea that the only way to make an impact in education or to reach certain goals is to focus really on driving achievement, I kind of have a different perspective on that. Sorry, let me let this person in. Okay. Another way to kind of approach impact, because at the end of the day, it's less about achievement and more about impact. So another way to approach impact is to ensure that everyone in the building feels safe and is taken care of first and foremost, echoing what someone mentioned earlier about this a culture code of safety being so important. And one of the major ways that you can start to make this shift is by embracing a wellness first model, where you can focus first, not necessarily deliberately on teacher retention or on student achievement or test scores or specifically on any of the other factors, but focusing first on ensuring that everyone feels safe and is taken care of in the building. So let's just do a quick temperature check. I want you to put a 1 in the chat if the idea of kind of focusing on wellness first makes you feel a little uncomfortable, or if you're not sure exactly how to prioritize yourself or your wellness, and put a 2 in the chat if you feel pretty comfortable with this idea. And as you're putting these in, okay, awesome, good. I'm glad to see all of the 2s. Sometimes I get 1s and 2s. For anyone who might be feeling like a 1 but didn't want to say, that's okay and totally normal. Getting out of our comfort zones often makes us uncomfortable. So we tend to feel a little bit more comfortable when we have an idea of what to do to get started. So I think focusing specifically on managing stress is a really nice kind of get your feet wet opportunity to kind of ease into this wellness first model. And it targets one of the biggest health and well-being issues that educators face. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So basically, what we have talked about thus far is the culture code, just in general, what it is, and then zooming in a little bit more to look specifically at what that might look like in education, and then zooming in a little bit more to what is the general model that we tend to follow based on this culture code. How can we shift that? And like, what is one specific thing that we can do to start to shift that? And I am reading these comments. Yes, I also think that it is important as women leaders that we model this wellness model for others that we serve. Exactly. Exactly. Yep. And filling your cup first. One, but only because of the guilt. Yes, a lot of educators struggle with the guilt and feeling like you have to put others first. So you are not at all alone in that. And that is why we're talking about this right now. So let's go ahead and jump to the next slides. Like I said, now we're looking at stress specifically as a nice way for you to kind of start to ease into this. But first, I think it's really important to make a distinction between stress and stressor. So a stressor is anything in the outside world that knocks you out of a homeostatic balance. It's what happens in the environment that triggers stress in the body. And basically stressors, that's a very biological kind of definition from Sapolsky, but essentially it is what activates the stress response in the body. It's something that happens, whether that be, your bumper to bumper traffic or your last minute need to find a substitute for a teacher on, 4 a.m. on a Monday morning, or, having to change your face-to-face instruction plans due to COVID. These are all stressors. So then when we talk about stress, this is the neurological and physiological shift that happens in your body when you encounter one of those threats. So all of the stressors, whether we recognize them as such or not, are really threats to our bodies. That is how our bodies interpret those stressors. And stress is the response to those threats. So stress is a very natural and biological response. It keeps us safe, but in excess, it can also be very harmful. While you're handling the day's stressors, your body is handling the day's stress. So it's absolutely essential to your well-being that you give your body the resources it needs to complete the stress response cycle. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. First, quick question for you. So true or false? We're going to start talking about the impact of stress on teachers. Teachers have the highest rates of daily stress of all occupation groups. Do you think this is true or false? And you can go ahead and drop them in the chat. Moving from 1 to 2 takes a deep connection with self. Yep, totally agree. True. Yep, Heather, you're spot on. So yes, the answer unfortunately is true. Teachers have the highest rate of daily stress among all occupational groups, tied with nurses, also at 46%, and higher than physicians, who come in right underneath at 45%. So just to give you an idea of if you ever feel like, everyone else is stressed too, the work that we do as educators is a completely different ball game. Let me go to the next one. All right, so like I said, starting to talk a little bit more about the impact of stress on teachers. As we all know, teachers play a very critical role in shaping the lives of children, and they not only facilitate learning, but they also influence a child's social and emotional development. Unfortunately, that teachers, or most teachers, social and emotional development happens to suffer. Today, teaching is, one of the most stressful occupations in the US, and high levels of stress are affecting teacher health and well-being, causing teacher burnout, lack of engagement, job dissatisfaction, poor performance, and high turnover rates. So then when we start to look at that, that domino effect that we talked about before with the leaders, when we look at the domino effect of teacher-related stress, it also impacts students. So overall, it results in lower achievement for students and higher costs for schools. And the cost of teacher burnout is estimated to be over $7 billion per year. And as you can see, in terms of the exact breakdown of how it affects students, we're talking about instability among staff. And there's research out there that links to how stable school communities, stable schools with consistent teachers and leaders help to better support students or lead to better student outcomes. So when you start to have teachers who are leaving, you have to hire sometimes less experienced teachers, which can sometimes lead to lower student achievement. And then when we take this a step further and we start to look at school districts, like I said, it costs school districts estimated about $7 billion or over $7 billion per year. So this is an issue even outside of the bottom line or the money. This is an issue throughout entire school systems. It is affecting teachers and leaders in the school districts at large. And then when we look specifically at leaders, the current principal turnover rate for high school principals, at least from this study, is a change in leadership once every 3.6 years. So let's say once every 4 years, roughly. And then when in a study done in Texas that looked at some administrative data, it was reported that about 22% of principals and administrators switched jobs from one year to the next, and not switch jobs like, you know, you were a principal and then you went back to the classroom, switching jobs as in leaving the field as a whole. And a lot of this is related to stress. Again, when in this research, when they asked these educators and administrators and school leaders what the primary cause of the issue is, stress was one of the top reasons for why people were leaving the field. So this is a graphic that was originally from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, specifically for teachers. I adapted it to also include school leaders. So this is kind of a nice graphic design of exactly what we have been talking about thus far, just the way that stress really impacts educators in ways that are very clear-cut, in ways that may not be as clear-cut. Everything from the school organization and the job demands to just high turnover and also higher education costs. So now we'll jump on over to the next one. So I kind of just want you to think, you don't have to drop it in the chat. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. I want you to think about how you are managing stress. Are you, like, what specifically are you doing? And then why are you doing those things? Is it because someone told you to do it, or because you saw someone else doing it, whether that be someone you know personally, some type of PD opportunity, you read it on a blog, you heard it from your doctor, or are you doing it because it's something that you know for sure works for you, meaning you know the science and the research behind it, you feel a difference in your body when you engage in this activity, so on and so forth. I just want you to kind of think about that. And then also, okay, there we go. And then the next question is it effective? And this one I actually do want you to drop in the chat. So given what you just thought about, if you think what you do is effective, I want you to just say yes. And if you think that it isn't effective, meaning you still feel overwhelmed or stressed after you engage in that activity, I want you to just drop a no. Nice. Managing stress through exercise, would that fall off during remote teaching? Yes. I think a lot of teachers experience that. Needing to find time to work out. Yeah. Okay, awesome. So I'm not seeing anyone say no, which is good. So here is kind of a quick and dirty way to ensure that it is actually something that is effective. Like I said before, many slides back, talking specifically about needing to complete the stress response cycle. And I said that we would get to that later. Now is the time. So here's how to know that this is actually effective. So there are 3 components to an effective stress management strategy. And when I say the stress response cycle, like I said, you experience a stressor first, then that causes the response in your body, which is the actual stress. And then in order to complete that cycle, you have to do something that helps to return your body to that homeostatic balance that tells it that everything is safe and that those cortisol levels can drop, you know, among other things. So there are kind of 2 ways that you can do this. If you actually complete the cycle, then exactly what I said happens, everything kind of goes back into balance. But if you don't complete the cycle, that's how you end up with chronic stress and the effects of chronic stress, or the buildup of those lingering chemicals like cortisol in your body, and then chronic stress leads to burnout. So 3 components of an effective stress management strategy. It has to be something biologically based, like we have already discussed. Stress is an internal occurrence. It's a biological or physiological response to the stressor. that is when, like I said, cortisol levels increase among other chemical reactions. So your response to that also needs to be something internal. And that is why the example of exercise that some of you have already mentioned, I always use that example, not that that is the only thing that you can do, but it's one that's easy for people to really piece together, because exercise also releases serotonin and endorphin. So we're talking, bad chemical reaction or unhelpful chemical reaction for helpful chemical reaction. So that's part one. The second thing is that it needs to be practiced consistently. We are starting or opening so many stress response cycles throughout our days. Like I said, every little stressor that you encounter starts a stress response cycle. So like I said, from when you wake up in the morning, your feet hit the ground and you're running, to your bumper to bumper traffic, to whatever you have to deal with throughout your day, to coming home and possibly having to care for your family or a spouse, and so on. All of these things activate stress response cycles. So the easiest way to actually effectively manage stress is to ensure that you're practicing these things consistently, which increases the likelihood that you're closing those cycles on a regular basis. And then the last part is that it needs to be tailored to your needs. There's really nothing worse than trying to do something that does not work for you. Everything is not for everybody, and that's okay. Figure out what works for you and stick with that. Okay, and here are just some ways to complete the stress response cycle. So we've already talked about exercise. There's also breathing, particularly deep breathing, that is helpful. Positive social interaction, affection from someone you like, respect, and trust, and who likes, respects, and trusts you. Crying, there's a reason why you tend to feel better after a good cry. And not that I am encouraging people to force themselves to cry, but if you feel the need, it's probably good for you to go ahead and let that out. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system and restores the body to that balance. And then also creative expression. So like I said, the one culture code that we should all stop following is serving others relentlessly. And a really easy step in the right direction is learning how to effectively manage stress. You can change the way that you choose to be of service. You do not have to serve others at the cost or the expense of neglecting yourself. Many of us want to serve well, foster, nurture, and create impact without realizing that nurturing ourselves is step one in that process, and that this is how we actually serve to our fullest capacity. So what is actually necessary to trade this culture code? We know what you can do to start kind of stepping in that direction on a more tangible basis, but then when it comes time to do this in front of other people or to push back in front of other people, what is actually required? So the first thing is kind of this external shift. You may have to go against the grain of your school building or the culture of where you are, both socially and culturally. And you kind of have to keep in mind that while you can't control how other people move, you do have control over how you move. And I said this before, but I would love for you to write this down. People get the best of me when I have the best to give. That is just the honest truth. And I think that's one thing that can really help you to stay grounded. And then I also want you to think about 1 to 3 things that you can do better in your role as an educator if you focused more on taking care of yourself. And that's also going to help you to stay grounded. And then there's this internal shift. You have to be willing to make the shifts in your mind to reposition how you view yourself and your value in the particular sector of education that you work in. Shift the way that you care for yourself as a human being, shift the way that you think about how you can create professional impact, and also confront some of those limiting beliefs that you may have. So that is the end of my presentation. I would love for you to stay in touch. I love kind of cultivating community. So if you scan this QR code, and this will also be good for people who might be catching it on the replay, this QR code is my digital business card, and you can find my website, my email address, and all my social media handles here. And I'm also going to just really quickly look at the chat to see if there are any questions before I jump off. And then these are just some of my sources. Thanks again so much for watching. I hope that you found it useful and that something resonated with you. All right, I think that's it for me.